Well, we're very glad to have Dr. Li to come back this year again, and then he's our old friend, and he's very supportive. Every time we have translation seminar, he's one of the speakers. He has many publications related to linguistics, interpretation, translation, and we are friends for almost 20 years. Okay. Yeah, Dr. Li is a professor at the San Francisco State University, where I got my BA, and he's one of my teachers. Okay, let's welcome Dr. Li.
Thank you. Okay, sure. So I'm going to try speaking without the microphone and see if it's okay with everybody. If it's not, then I'll pick it up and make it loud. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, I see. Okay, that makes a difference. Yeah. All right. I will use it then. So I'm very, very glad to be back here and have this opportunity to speak with everybody and hopefully also learn from everybody that is over here. It's my first time on this new campus. This looks like a great environment to learn in. I'm really glad to be here. Okay, so today what I would like to do is to kind of continue the topic that I spoke on last year. Last year I was hoping to contrast the translation commentaries of Xuan Zang and Zan Ning, I guess you could say two medieval translators and translation experts. But last year I only got as far as Xuan Zang. So this year I'm hoping to continue that and go on to Zan Ning. The title of my talk is Intratextual and Extratextual. Oh, what is this? If you set up your device, okay. Intratextual and extratextual considerations in the translation commentaries of Xuan Zang and Zan Ning. Okay, and without further ado, let me go ahead. So what I'm hoping to do in this series is examine a lot of the translation commentaries of many of our medieval Buddhist translators, but I also have a certain focus and a certain area of interest. So in terms of choice of materials, I'm more interested in texts that lend themselves to comparison with Western linguistic theory and translation theory. I'll explain that a little more a little later. And in looking at their commentaries, I'm interested in working out the system behind their thinking. Okay, so let me elaborate on that. So when it comes to the choice of texts, my interest is in commentaries that have more of a linguistic focus. I tend to look less at commentaries that focus on things like moral proclivities, religious outlook, or literary style. Not that they're not important, but because my area of study is linguistics, I tend to focus on that. So when it comes to choosing commentaries, I am especially interested in the commentaries of Xuan Zang and his 5 translatables. I'm also interested in Zan Ning's 6 dimensions, which touch upon, I think, pragmatics and the implementation of translation. I tend not to go so much into Dao An's 五诗本三不易, which I think have more of a focus on editorial matters and audience reception. And I don't talk so much about Yanzong's 八倍, which talks about things like being modest, pious, honest, open-minded, etc. Okay, so this is my choice of materials when I look at these commentaries. Now, when it comes to methods of analysis, I'm interested in taking a critical look at the proposals of these commentators. So I'm going to be not just repeating or explaining what they say, but looking at their system. What are the structural elements of their thinking? And what are the relations or dependencies between these different elements? This is what I'm hoping to do in today's talk. Okay, so a quick overview of what I'm hoping to do today. My overall talk, I think, is divided into 3 sections. First, I would like to give a theoretical background, talking a little bit about what translation is and the intratextual, paratextual, and extratextual elements of translation. And after that, I was supposed to go into Xuan Zang's 5 untranslatables, and then on to Zan Ning's 6 dimensions. Xuan Zang's commentaries, I believe, focus more on the intratextual considerations of translation, and Zan Ning's on not only the intratextual considerations, but also the extratextual ones. But today, because of time, just to make sure that I cover Zan Ning, that I didn't get to cover last year, I'm going to begin with a theoretical background, and then skip over to Zan Ning, and then if I have time, I'll come back again to Xuan Zang. And just to help me get an idea, how many of you were here for my talk on Xuan Zang last year? Okay, so there are a few, but there are also people who weren't here, so maybe it is worth covering some of Xuan Zang if we have time towards the end. Okay, so let's begin with the theoretical background. Okay, I'm gonna begin with a very basic question. What is translation? Now, all of you are translators, so you're probably feeling we don't need to ask this question. I know what translation is. But the reason why I want to bring it out here is because by giving an operational definition of translation, a very simple one, it'll allow us to take the different components apart. And then later on, when we look at the different translation commentaries, we can then understand which parts of this definition they are addressing. Okay, so allow me, if it is okay, to first begin with a definition. What is translation? Now, traditional understandings of translation usually, before I go there, okay. Before we can define translation, we need to decide whether we're talking about translation as a product or translation as a process. And you have this problem both in Chinese language and in English language, because the word translation in both languages can refer to either a product or a process. Okay, now, for now, I'm just going to define translation as a process rather than a product, meaning if I tell you that I am translating, I'm going to translate something, what exactly does it mean? What exactly is it that I am doing? Now, traditionally, people have seen translation as a process that happens between two texts. So you have an input text and you have an output text. And translation is something that you do to the input text to produce the output text. What do you think that something is? What do we do to the input text in order for us to call it translation? Anyone? Primary source? What's the action that we do, though, to the primary source? So we're interpreting what it means, is it? So if I'm interpreting, does that mean I'm translating? No. So what makes it count as translating? Well, you're kind of using translation to define translation then. Yeah. Sorry? I can't hear you very clearly. Replication? Did you say replication? Oh, replication. So if I replicate the text, then it's translation? Okay, I think that's very important. You have to change the register or the language. So you have to change the medium, so to speak. And in most cases, it involves changing the language. Okay, so you do have to change something in order for it to count as translation. Okay, so we have to convert the language. But do we convert the language in just any old way? If I were to take a sentence like, let me take something in Chinese, 这是一本书, and I convert it into English. You are all sitting here. I converted the language. Is that translation? Okay, good. So it's not translation because in addition to converting something, we also have to preserve something, right? What's that something we want to preserve? Very good. So in most cases, it's the meaning. There are some cases where you don't preserve the meaning, but for now, I'm just going to go with meaning preservation. So if you take a text, you change the language, but at the same time you preserve the meaning, I think that is what most people understand to be translation. So this is a good starting point to understanding what translation is from an intratextual perspective. We convert the language, we preserve the meaning, And then a lot of the earlier Western commentaries on translation have focused on these two processes. So for example, we have a variant in translation, and that is language. We have something that doesn't change, the invariant, that is meaning. And a lot of the commentaries in the Western tradition have focused on how to preserve meaning and how to convert language. So for example, okay, before I go on into the details, let me just take an analogy from Zan Ning, who we're going to look at later. So in explaining what translation is, Zan Ning gives us first an analogy and then an example. Okay, his analogy is this. He says, 譬诸橘子焉，由异土而直，橘化为枳，枳橘之乎虽疏，而心方干叶无益. Okay, so there are two types of oranges in China. There's one type in northern China called the, I think it's the zhi, and the one in southern China is the ji. They're different species, but although they look different, when you start to taste them and smell them, the taste and the smell is the same. So he says that's what you want to do in translation. You produce something that is different in outward appearance, but when you savor it, the taste and the smell is the same. So he begins with this analogy, and then he goes on to give an actual example. He says, in the western regions, there is this tree called the Niagara, and what that is really is what in China people call the willow tree. Okay, so he says that although they have different names, they refer to the same reference, the same object, and that is what we want to do in translation. Okay, so going back to what we were talking about, in translation there is a variant, which is the language, and there is an invariant, which is the meaning, and a lot of the earlier theories of translation focused on these two aspects. For example, it would look at how to preserve meaning, and it would divide meaning into different parts, the denotation and the connotation. It would then divide the connotation into the register and the collocation, and it would further divide the register into things like genre, field, tenor, mode, tone, variation, and collocation into things like the preservation of idioms, proverbs, and metaphors. And it would discuss how to do all of this, how to preserve all these different types of meaning, what to preserve, what not to preserve, when to preserve what. Okay, this is the study of translation from the perspective of preserving meaning. And then it would also look at translation from the perspective of converting language. What level of language are you trying to convert? Are you looking at the form or the function of language? If you're looking at the form, are you looking at the phonology, the morphology, or the syntax? And for example, if you're preserving the phonology, the sound, usually in Chinese we call that yin yi, or phonological translation. This is often used for the translation of names, place names, personal names. Or if you want to preserve the language, if you want to convert the language at the morphological or syntactic level, what this often leads to is what we call literal translation or word-for-word translation. Whereas if you're looking at more the function of what this language is trying to achieve, then you're looking more at pragmatics and you're translating more at the sense for sense or functional level. Okay, so this is considering how to preserve meaning and how to convert the language. This has been the traditional focus of translation theory, which focuses on the intratextual dimension of translation, the conversion between two different texts. But today we're not going to just focus on the intratextual dimension. We're going to go a little further because Zan Ning, one of the people that we are looking at, goes a little further. And this is something that is very modern about his thinking. Okay. And we find this in Western translation theory too. From the 1980s onwards, we start to get people looking beyond the conversion of texts. For example, the rise of functionalist translation theories and the cultural turn in translation studies since the 1990s. Okay, the functionalist translation theories, most notably Scopus theory, sees translation as a purposeful activity. It doesn't see translation as a process between texts, but a kind of behavior. And in looking at translation this way, these theorists believe that you need to consider the purpose of the original translation. It's not just the text, but what am I trying to achieve with this text? You need to also consider things like the setting of the original communication. If you have the same text, but it's placed in different settings, the purpose might be different. And you need to consider even things like, what is the relationship between the speaker and the listener? Okay, if they know each other versus if they're total strangers, then when the same text is uttered, the effect might be different. Okay, so this is looking at translation from more of a functionalist view. And then from the 1990s, or you could say the late 1980s onwards, you have the cultural turn in translation theory, which I talked about before. But today I'm just going to focus on one aspect of this, which is translator visibility or translator agency. And I'm going to be dividing this into three types: intratextual agency, paratextual agency, and extratextual agency. What this is saying is when a translator is translating a text, how can he insert himself into the text? You might think of translation as a process where the translator is invisible. He's supposed to respect the text and not add any of his own views into the text while he's translating. But according to this school of thinking, that isn't always the case. The translator is always inserting himself into the text, and he can insert himself into the text in one of three ways. The first is intratextual agency. That is when he leaves a stylistic footprint in his translation of the text. So perhaps when I'm translating, let's say if I'm translating from Chinese to English, perhaps I like it to sound more like idiomatic English, to sound more natural. That is one way I'm inserting my preferences into the translation. Or perhaps I don't. I want the translation to sound more Chinese. Again, making that particular decision is part of inserting my preferences into the translation. Okay, this is intratextual agency. Okay, making certain choices at the textual level. And then there is the second one, which is paratextual agency. That is, in addition to translating this text, perhaps I write an introduction. Perhaps I write a foreword or an epilogue to explain what I'm doing. So I'm adding another text to the text. That is another way the translator can influence his readers. Okay, that is through paratextual agency, texts that are outside the original source text. And then there is extratextual agency, which is, imagine I'm translating a Buddha Sutra from Chinese into English. Let's say something like what's the example that I have here? Okay, let's say the Diamond Sutra. There are different editions of the Diamond Sutra, right? Which edition am I going to choose? And am I going to translate from the Sanskrit or translate from the Chinese? By making this particular choice, my end product, my translation is going to be very different. Okay, so things like my choice of which text to translate and how do I enhance the status of the text by translating it, and publicity activities that I do to promote my translation. This is extratextual agency. Now, in today's talk, I'm not going to be focusing much on the middle one, the paratextual aspect. I'm going to be focusing on the first and the third. So I'm going to be contrasting intratextual agency with extratextual agency in the commentaries of Xuan Zang and Zan Ning. And as I said before, Xuan Zang and most of the earlier translators focus mostly on issues that have to do with intratextual agency, whereas Zan Ning is kind of unique in that he goes into issues of extratextual agency. Now, another way to look at this, which might be a little simpler, is to think of translation this way. When you think of translation as a process, there are three parties to this process. First of all, you have a text. Okay, let's say I'm trying to translate the Huayan Jing. Okay, there are different Chinese versions of the Huayan Jing. There's the 60 fascicle, the 80 fascicle, or the 40 fascicle Huayan Jing. By choosing one of these, my end product is going to be very different. Okay, so this is to do with the choice that I am translating from. I could also choose to translate from the Tibetan version or the Chinese version. So in choosing a text, I am in a way inserting myself into the translation. This is the textual aspect of the translation process. And then another element is the translator. Okay, let's say I am translating this text. Am I a native speaker of the source language? Am I a native speaker of the target language? And my language abilities are going to influence my translation, right? Also, my cultural proficiency level is going to influence my translation. So who you use as the translator is also very important. The text is important, the choice of text is important, but the choice of translator is also going to make the end product different. And finally, an aspect that they haven't talked about, but which I think is important in this age, is what tools are we using when we are translating. So we can have dictionaries that we can use, or in this age, we also have very large language corpora that we can consult. We might even be using translation tools like machine translation or translation memory. We might even be using AI. Okay, so what tools we're using also affect how our end product is going to be. So in translating, we have to consider the text, the translator, and the tools. Okay, and that I think ends my theoretical section. Let me now go on to my section on Zan Ning. I'm going to have to skip a little bit. Okay, so now I'm skipping from part 1, theoretical background, to part 3, which is Zan Ning's 6 innovations, 新意六例. I'm going to first divide this section into 3 parts. I'll talk very briefly about who Zan Ning is, and then yeah. 6 dimensions. Oh, okay. I might have forgotten to update the term. I'm going to call it 6 innovations for now. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so 3 sections. First, I'll talk about who Zan Ning is. Then I'll talk a little bit about his methodology, which I think is quite unique. And then we'll go on to talk about his 6 innovations, which are the focus of what we want to say about Zan Ning. Okay, first, who is Zan Ning? We don't know a huge... We don't have a huge amount of information about him. We just know that he was a monk that lived in the 10th century or so, and he was apparently very intelligent, very sharp. He had very good debating skills, so they had this nickname for him, this 律虎, this tiger of rules. And he was bestowed the honorific by the emperor, 通会大师, okay, the master of thorough intelligence, or something like that. And he is best known for being the author of this work, the biography of eminent monks published in the Song Dynasty, so called the 大宋高僧传, or sometimes just the 宋高僧传. And the commentaries that we're going to share on translation appear in chapters 1 to 3 of this 大宋高僧传. Okay, this is a 30-chapter work, and his commentaries are mainly in chapter 1 to chapter 3. Okay, and he is best known for his 6 innovations. So the 新意, I'm going to call innovations over here. And let me first tell you what these 6 innovations are. Okay, his first innovation or first consideration is 一字一音为一例. The choice to replace either the word or the choice to replace either the sound or the symbol. The second innovation is to consider what the source language is, whether it's an Indic language or an Iranic language. The third innovation is the consideration of 重义 or 直译. I'll talk about what that is a little later. The fourth consideration is to consider whether the source text is using coarse or refined language, that is the social register of the source text. The fifth innovation is the consideration of whether you want to translate into literary or vernacular Chinese when you're translating the text. And the last innovation is to consider whether you're translating the literal meaning or the suggestive meaning. Okay, so these are Zan Ning's 6 innovations. But before we talk about what the innovations are, before we go into the details, I want to talk a little bit about Zan Ning's approach. I think he is very methodical in the way he presents everything. And in that way, he is a lot like a modern day research student. Okay, you see with a lot of medieval commentators, wherever they are from, they tend to just say what they believe. But Zan Ning is like a research student in that before he says what he believes, he first gives a definition, and then he goes on to give what I think is like a literature review before he actually goes on to say, with this understanding of what people have already said, I'm going to add a few things that are new. Okay, so if he were living in this day and age, I think he'd be able to write a pretty good PhD thesis. Okay, so let's look at what he says. First, he has a, So first he has a literature review. Before he says anything, he says, let's look back at what people have already said. And then he says, Dao An talked about the 5 distortions and 3 challenges. Yan Cong talked about the 8 prerequisites. Ming Ze talked about the translation protocols, and we don't have this text anymore, so we don't know what these translation protocols are. And then he also goes on to say that Xuan Zang talks about the 5 untranslatables. And then he goes on to say, with this understanding of what people have already said, let me add 6 new considerations. So his 6 new considerations is on top of what people have already said. And this, I believe, is quite unique. Zan Ning also goes on to give a definition of translation. This is his translation. He says, 义之言义也，所以所有义，谓以所有义所无也。So he is basically using one character to define a character, another character. The character that he wants to define is this one, yi, which we take to mean translation. And the character that he uses to define translation is this one. In modern Chinese, it's also pronounced yi. So you might be thinking he's using a homonym to define translation, but that's actually not the case back in his day. Back in medieval Chinese, these 2 characters are pronounced differently. I think if you're a Cantonese speaker or a Taiwanese speaker and you pronounce these 2 words, they're different sounds, okay, even though they sound the same in Mandarin. Okay, so the point here, though, is that he's using this character yi to define translation. Now, what is the meaning of the character yi? This is the yi that you get in the I Ching, or the Book of Changes. So in a way, you could say that he's defining translation as change. However, the tricky part about this is that in the I Ching, there are 3 different senses to this character yi. Change is just one of them. What are the 3 senses? Okay, the first is simplicity. The second is change. And the third is invariance. Remember early on when we defined translation, we said there was something we need to change and there was something that we needed to have not change? So in this character yi, you have both of these senses. You have the meaning of not changing something, not changing the meaning, and you have the meaning of changing something, changing the language. Both of these senses are preserved in Zan Ning's definition. And on top of that, you also have the meaning of to simplify. So when you're translating something, you are in a way simplifying a text for your readership, especially a readership, let's say, that doesn't understand the source language, but understands the target language. So by translating the text, you're making things simpler for them. So you're simplifying, you're changing, and at the same time, you're not changing or preserving something. So this, I think, is a pretty clever thing that Zan Ning does, using this 3-level definition, all in one character, to define what translation is. Now, another thing you need to know about Zan Ning is that his understanding of a lot of these terms is very different from how we use these terms in Chinese in modern times. So, for example, his first innovation is 一字一音为一例. Okay, if you're Chinese, you've probably heard of 一音 before, right? Any Chinese people here? Chinese speakers who have heard of 一音? Anybody know what 一音 is? 音译, okay, what's 音译? Okay. Preserve the sound. Okay, so in modern Chinese, when we say yi or yin yi, we mean a phonological translation, preserving the sound. For example, coffee in English becomes kafe in Chinese. Sofa in English becomes shafa in Chinese. That's what we understand to be yin yi. Not in Zan Ning's writing. In Zan Ning's writing, it's actually the other way around. Zan Ning takes yi to mean replace, not preserve. So when he uses yi, he means to replace the sound. So in Zan Ning's terminology, if you were to take a term like hot dog in English and you translate it into 热狗, the sound is different. That is yi because you're replacing the sound. And on the other hand, 一字, we take to mean translate at the word level. This is what he means by preserving the sound. Okay, so it's the exact. Oh, okay. You mean the 直译 part? Oh, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, let's look at that now. 直译. In modern Chinese, 直译 means to translate literally. So translate word for word, that is 直译. That is not what Zan Ning refers to by 直译. Actually, let me make these things appear. Okay, what does Zan Ning refer to by 直译? I'll give you in a minute. And then things like 雅俗. Okay, in modern Chinese, a lot of people take 雅 to mean elegant, 俗 to mean vulgar. So 雅俗 is the choice between elegant language and vulgar language. And again, that's not what Zan Ning means at all. So later on, we will see that when Zan Ning talks about yi, he is talking about semantic translation. When Zan Ning talks about 直译, he is talking about direct translation, that is directly from the source language rather than via another language. So let's say if I'm translating a work of French literature into Chinese, I'm translating from French into English rather than translating from the English translation of the French. Okay. And then when he talks about 雅俗, he is talking about the choice between literary and vernacular Chinese rather than whether something sounds elegant or vulgar. And then when he talks about 义字, he is talking about phonological translation, which is replacing the word and preserving the sound. Okay, this is something we need to keep in mind in order to understand the 6 innovations. Otherwise, it can be very confusing. Okay then, let's jump right in and look at the 6 innovations. And a quick reminder, the 6 innovations are these. The first is whether we want to replace the sound or the symbol. The second is, are we translating from an Indic or Iranic language? The third is whether the translation is a native speaker or a non-native speaker. The fourth is whether we're using formal or informal language. The fifth is whether we're translating into literary or vernacular Chinese. And the sixth is whether we're looking at literary or suggestive meaning. Okay, let's begin with the first one. Do we replace the sound or replace the symbol? Okay. And with each of these questions, you could say that Zan Ning is very methodical. He is a very logical person. So he always gives you 4 options. So if we're asking, are we going to replace the sound or replace the symbol? Option number 1 is replace the sound but don't replace the symbol. Option 2 is replace the symbol but don't replace the sound. Option 3 is replace both the sound and the symbol. Option 4 is replace neither the sound and the symbol. Okay, we're going to get 4 options for every one of his innovations. Okay, and these are the 4 options here. Okay, so let's go to option number 1. Option number 1 is you preserve the sound but replace the symbol. Okay, this is a process that I think you're all familiar with. This is phonological translation. And the example that Zan Ning gives is in the translation of Dharani. So for example, the Dharani at the end of the Heart Sutra, the gate gate para gate para samgate bodhisvaha, that is an instance of preserving the sound but replacing the symbol. Now, what does he mean by replacing the symbol? Okay, assuming that this was originally written in Sanskrit script. Okay, Sanskrit is one type of symbol. Chinese characters, that's another type of symbol. So we're converting the symbol from Sanskrit into Chinese, that symbol level conversion, but the sound remains the same. Okay, so this is what he refers to by replacing the symbol but preserving the sound. And the example that he gives is the same example that Xuan Zang uses when he talks about phonological translation. Okay, so this is option number 1. Preserve the sound, but not the symbol. Option number 2, preserve the symbol, but not the sound. That is, the symbol stays the same, but we're going to call it by a different name. And the example that he gives is the swastika symbol. Okay, so this is a symbol that you see often in Buddhism. In Sanskrit, it's called svastika. It means good fortune or well-being. And Chinese preserves the symbol, but gives it a different name. The name that it gives to this is Van at the time of Zan Ning, and Wan in modern Chinese. It means 10,000 or eternity, so it kind of has the same meaning and the same symbol, but the way we address it, the name that we call it by, is different. Okay, so this is replacing sound, but preserving the symbol. Number 3 is replacing both the sound and the symbol. This is normal translation. So when we translate any text, if we're not trying to preserve the sound, we're basically taking Sanskrit script, replacing it with Chinese script, so the symbol is changed, right? And the way you read the Sanskrit is different from the way you read the Chinese, so the sound is changed too. So when you change both the sound and the symbol, this is what we do most of the time in translation. This is option number 3. And option number 4 is when you replace neither the sound nor the symbol. And the example that Zan Ning gives is, he says that in Buddhist scripts, there are these little symbols in the margins. Okay, what do they do? What are they called? They don't seem to have names. They're kind of just there. And when you're translating into the Chinese, you don't have to do anything to them. You just keep them the way they were, and you don't call them anything. This is replacing neither the sound nor the symbol. Yeah. He just says it's something next to the chapter headings, something next to the headings, but he doesn't say what purpose they serve. Now, my understanding is, if you were to use a modern analogy, when you're designing a modern book, chapter 1, and you have the title of the chapter, you have something like this for design purposes, right? If you were translating, you don't really need to call this anything. You don't need to replace it with a Chinese symbol. You can just leave it the way it is, something that has no name but serves a decorative purpose. Okay, with this type of stuff, you need to replace neither the sound nor the symbol. Well, icon. By definition, an icon has to resemble the idea that it's representing. I think it's just a design element. I would call it a design element. Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. If you know anything more about it, I'd love to learn more. Okay. All right, but let me finish this first. So that's our first innovation, whether to replace the sound or the symbol. Okay, so let's go on to our second innovation, which is the consideration of what the source language is. Is it an Indic language from South Asia, or is it an Iranic language from Central Asia? And before he talks about the different options, Zan Ning kind of explains what he is referring to. So he says the Indic languages are spoken in the 5 Brahman kingdoms, or the 5 Indic kingdoms, where they use pure Sanskrit. And the Iranic languages are spoken north of the snowy mountains, that is, north of the Himalayas, and the Chinese refer to it as Hu. So the Indic, Fan, and the Iranic, Hu. So the source language of a text can be Indic. The source language of a text can be Iranic. It can be a mix of Indic and Iranic, or it can be neither Indic nor Iranic. So there again, you have all 4 logical possibilities. Okay, so he gives you some of the geography of what he refers to by Indic and what he refers to by Iranic. And he uses the Himalayas kind of as a boundary. And then for the Iranic languages, he gives 2 examples. One is Tuhuoluo, Turkmenistan, which is what the Greeks used to call Bactria, which is in present-day Afghanistan. And the other example is Jiabi Shi Kapisa, which is also in northeastern Afghanistan. Okay, so apparently a lot of the Buddhist texts that China received at his time came from these areas. Now, the reason why he believed it was important to identify the source text is people used to confuse them. So he goes on to give us a bit of history. He says, prior to the 6th century, hypocorrection was happening a lot. So he was saying that prior to the 6th century, the Chinese understood all Buddhist texts to have come from Central Asia. Even texts that originated in India, they believed was Iranic or Central Asian. So they would often take Indian terms to be Central Asian terms. They would often take Indian figures to be figures from Central Asia. So there was this type of hypocorrection. And then after the 6th century, there was hypercorrection. They started to understand that Buddhist texts came from India, so they thought all the texts that they came into contact with was from India, even the ones that were composed in Central Asia or had Central Asian elements. So in this period, they believed everything was from India. And Zan Ning believed the real situation is some texts come from India, some texts come from Central Asia, some texts are Indian texts that have had some Central Asian influence in them, and you need to distinguish which is which. Okay, you need to be able to distinguish what kind of text is Sanskrit, what kind of text is Central Asian, and when it comes to terminology, you need to be able to understand, is this an Indian term or is it a Central Asian term? Otherwise, you're going to be mixing languages and mixing cultures. And then he goes on to explain 3 of the dangers of non-discrimination. If you don't make such a distinction, then number 1, you may be assigning an Indic origin to an Iranic element. You may be mistaking an Iranic term for an Indian term. And you are oblivious to the process of indirect translation and cultural refraction. That is, sometimes when we translate, we're translating not just language, but culture. So let's say when we're translating something from English into Chinese, if the cultural phenomenon in English doesn't exist in Chinese, we might replace that with an equivalent phenomenon in Chinese. Now, imagine that happening from India to Central Asia. And then you're translating a Central Asian text, and you don't understand that the example has been replaced. That can be a problem because you're not aware that this is an indirect translation. Let me give you an example of what he's talking about. Let's look at this text about cooking here. A typical French lunch will consist of, if I don't know any French, I might pronounce all of this as English, will consist of une entrée, such as a mixed salad, soup, terrine, or pate, and a traditional sandwich like croquis, monsieur, or jambon beurre. Okay, if I'm somebody who knows only English and no French, and I don't even know that these are French words, then my translation is going to come out very differently than if I have some awareness that this text contains a mix of French and English, right? That is the kind of thing that Zan Ning is talking about. He says that there are many Indian texts that come from India through Central Asia that have had some Central Asian influence in it. You need to be able to identify which elements are Central Asian and which elements are Indian. Okay, so this is the second innovation, being aware of whether the source language is Indic or Iranic. So his proposal, 3 points. Number 1, acknowledge the Indic source of the text. So most Buddhist texts come from India, so you need to understand this point. Most of them have an Indic source. But if it came through Central Asia, you have to be aware of later Iranic influences. If it came through Central Asia and Central Asians added to them, then there may be Central Asian terms in it. And why do we need to do this? Because you need to be aware of the dissemination of Buddhist texts through multiple language regions and different language additions. Okay, so, I'll give some more examples of this a little bit later. This is our second point. So this gives us a lot of things to think about. For example, a lot of us are translating Buddhist texts from Chinese into English. But these Buddhist texts originated in India and came through Central Asia. What is the extent of Central Asian influence in the Chinese text that we're looking at? Could there be elements in these Chinese texts that are actually Central Asian that weren't in the original Indian texts? Okay, this I think is something worth doing research into. And then if you're looking at Japanese and Korean texts, a lot of these texts came through Chinese. So in these Japanese Buddhist texts, are there elements that were added in at the Chinese stage that were not in the original Indian or Central Asian stage? And then if you're reading Buddhist texts in English, a lot of these English texts are translated from East Asian languages. How much of what you are reading are actually East Asian elements that were not there in the original Indic or Central Asian texts? So the extent of cultural influence, the level of cultural refraction, I think is something that we should look at. Okay, so we've covered the first two, whether to replace sound or symbol, and whether the source language is Indic or Iranic. Let's look at the third point, okay, which I haven't explained much. The original Chinese is 重义,直译为一例. Now, when it comes to these Chinese terms, there are a lot of common misunderstandings. One of them I already mentioned, which is the understanding of 直译 as a literal translation. That's not what Zan Ning means by 直译. Another way to look at it is to contrast 直译 and 重译, and you would understand 直译 as direct translation and 重译 as indirect translation. So something that was translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, that's a direct translation. Something that went from Sanskrit into an Iranic language and then was translated from that Iranic language into Chinese, that would be an indirect translation. That is one way to understand this, but then there's a problem, which is, haven't we already talked about that in innovation number 2? Innovation number 2 tells us to look at whether the source language is Indic or Iranic. So how is that different from asking whether it's a direct translation or an indirect translation? And the way I look at it is that innovation number 2 is different from innovation number 3 in that innovation number 2 is looking at the source language and the source text, the text itself, what language it's in. Whereas innovation number 3 is looking at who's doing the translation. Okay, the translator, what the translator's native language is. So I'm going to be explaining innovation number 3 from this angle. So if we look at it that way, then again we have 4 options. Okay, we're asking whether the translator is a native speaker of the source language, in this case Sanskrit. So option number 1, the translator is a native speaker of Sanskrit. Option number 2, the translator is a non-native speaker of Sanskrit, so his knowledge of Sanskrit is secondhand. This is most likely a Central Asian native, somebody who speaks an Iranic language. Option number 3 is an expatriate native speaker. Okay, somebody whose native language is Sanskrit, but who has lived in Central Asia for a long time. And then option number 4 is a discerning non-native speaker, somebody whose native language is not Sanskrit, let's say a Central Asian, but in his translation he takes special care not to let his mother tongue influence his translation. Okay, so these are our 4 options. Okay, the first option. The first option is a native speaker of the source language whose knowledge of that source language is firsthand. Okay, this would be ideal according to Zan Ning. If we were to draw an analogy with a situation people might be more familiar with, in China there are a lot of people who want to learn English. Ideally, if they want to learn American English, they want to learn it from an American native speaker who goes straight to China. Okay, that would be the first situation. The second situation is if you were to get this Buddhist text translated by a non-native speaker. This is kind of like if you were trying to learn English in China, but you're learning it not from a Native American speaker, but let's say from a European, French or German or Dutch speaker, who can speak the language, but it's not their native language. Okay, this is our second situation. And when that is the case, it could be that their understanding of English might be colored by their native language. And when it comes to translation, their translations from the Sanskrit might be colored by their native language in Central Asia. The third situation is when you have an expatriate native translator. Okay, you can think of this as an American who has lived in Europe for a long time, so English is his native language, but because he's lived in France for a long time, he's going to sprinkle in a few French terms every here and there. Okay, so an expatriate native speaker is a native speaker of Sanskrit who's lived in Central Asia, and because of his extended stay, he also introduces Central Asian terms into his translation of Buddhist texts. And the fourth situation is the discerning non-native speaker. That is somebody whose native language is not Sanskrit, but he is careful not to let it appear in his translation. Okay, so when it comes to the translator, we have these four options. This is innovation number 3. Okay, whether your text is coming from a native translator or a non-native translator. Okay, let's go to innovation number 4. And this is a consideration of whether the language is coarse or refined. We can kind of think of it as whether you're using informal language or formal language. And Zan Ning gives us a little bit of background on this. And the terms here are a little bit, there are some places where I'm not completely clear. So I'd love to discuss this with you a little bit later. The term he uses for the informal register is subanta. And in Sanskrit grammar, this usually has to do with nouns. And the term he uses for the formal register is tinyanta. And in Sanskrit, this usually has to do with verbs. And it's not very clear to me how nouns and verbs fit into this informal, formal dichotomy. So yeah, if anybody knows more, I'd love to learn more. He also says that when the Buddha was teaching his teachings, he used mainly informal language, subanta, to focus on the spirit of the teaching rather than the letter of the teaching, because he was trying to preach to the masses. If his language was too formal, then the masses would not understand. And he further introduces two other terms, which is 全声 and 半声. Now, the sheng here doesn't refer to sound. The sheng here refers to grammar in general. So 全声 would be a fully grammatical or fully standard language. And then 半声 would be a semi-standard language. So basically what he's talking about here is whether you want to use formal terms or informal terms when you're translating. Okay, and as you would expect, he gives us 4 options. Option number 1, to use coarse or informal language. Option number 2, use refined or formal language. Number 3, use both coarse and refined language. And option 4, use neither coarse or refined language. Okay, option number 1, he says that when the Buddha was preaching in India, he basically used this type of informal language. That is our first option. Option number 2, he mentions that when Chinese translators translate into Chinese, they usually translate into refined language. Option number 3, use of both coarse and refined language. Okay. He says that when Chinese translators translate into Chinese, if the translator is not an expert, that is to say, if he's not a scholar or a cleric who writes a lot, then chances are he's going to be mixing his vernacular language with his, actually, no, I think I'm confusing this with the next one. You know what, I think this is on some other slides. Oh, it's not. Okay. I might have missed something here. Okay, let me skip the elaboration for now. Option 3, using both coarse and refined. And then option 4, using neither coarse or refined language. He doesn't believe it's possible. So there is no option 4. He says that there is no such thing. Okay, let's go on to innovation number 5. Which is when you translate into Chinese, are you translating into literary Chinese or colloquial Chinese? Now, as I mentioned before, we shouldn't try to understand the original Chinese yasu as elegant or vulgar, because that is not what Zan Ning is referring to here. And this is a very common mistake to make. Not only do people make this mistake here, people make the same mistake when talking about Chinese translation theory, most notably the writings of Yan Fu. Okay, a lot of you familiar with Chinese translation theory might be familiar with Yan Fu, who says that when you translate, you have to achieve these three dimensions, xin, da, ya. And there are a lot of people who take this ya to mean elegant. Even somebody as knowledgeable as Zhao Yuanren makes the same mistake. So Zhao Yuanren criticizes Yan Fu's ya. He says ya is not always necessary because when you're translating, there are some situations where your language should not be elegant. So for example, in a court of law, when a plaintiff accuses the defendant of insulting him by saying, "You're a damn fool," should we make that "you're a damn fool" more elegant? If you do that, then this is not going to sound authentic, and it may even affect the outcome of the case. So in this case, he says you should not try to be elegant. If the original language is elegant, keep it elegant. If it's not, then keep it vulgar. Okay, this is Zhao Yuanren's understanding of ya. But unfortunately, he made a mistake. That is not what Yan Fu was talking about. Furthermore, if you think of yasu as elegant versus vulgar, then how is that any different from innovation number 4, coarse versus refined? He would be repeating himself again, right? So this ya here is definitely not elegance. If not elegance, what is it? He uses the word ya the same way Yan Fu uses ya, and that is he uses it for ya yan, which is literary Chinese. Now, this is something that is harder for us to understand in modern times because we don't have such a stark literary vernacular divide. We basically speak in modern English and we write in modern English. The way we write is not that different from the way we speak. The same goes for modern standard Chinese. However, for most of pre-modern history, in the case of Chinese prior to the 1920s, how you write was very different from how you speak. You speak in the local vernacular, but you write in the classical language, which is the language of 2,000 years ago. And most people who are not highly educated were not able to understand this written language. It's kind of like Europe before, let's say, the 1500s, when everybody wrote in Latin but spoke in the local vernacular. Okay, the written language is vastly different from the spoken language. And what Yan Fu was saying back then was that he wanted to translate into the literary language rather than the vernacular language. And what Zan Ning is saying here is, when we translate Buddhist texts into Chinese, should we translate into the vernacular language that everybody speaks, or should we translate it into the literary language, which is what is written in most respectable books? Now, a little bit of background. Even back in Zan Ning's time, there were things that were written in vernacular language rather than the literary language. Normally, the classics and formal essays would be in the classical language, but things like opera and oral storytelling would be written in the vernacular language. So you do have a choice there. Are these Buddha sutras more like opera or storytelling, or do you want them to feel more like the Chinese classics? Okay, that is what he is asking. Now, there are pros and cons for each of these situations. If you write it in the literary language, the more formal language, and actually I shouldn't use the word formal because then you would confuse innovation number 5 with innovation number 4. So I should say, if you write it in the vernacular language, the advantage is that everybody would understand, even the people that are not educated. And that is kind of what the Buddha intended when he was preaching. So that would be something going for translating into vernacular language. But the disadvantage of vernacular language is that the vernacular is different everywhere. So the vernacular in Beijing would be different from the vernacular in Shanghai or Guangzhou. So you would be limited to your region. And if you wanted to go beyond that limitation, you would have to translate into literary language. The literary language goes a lot farther. Not only is it understood throughout all of China, it is understood even beyond China. For example, the literary language is used in Japan, or was used in Japan. It was used in Korea, it was used in Vietnam. So if you translate into this option, then all of these people, even though they speak differently, they would still be able to read your text. Okay, so here I want to emphasize that innovation number 5, whether to translate into literary Chinese or vernacular Chinese, is a different dimension from whether to use refined or coarse language. Literary, refined and coarse is within the same language, whether you want it to sound more formal or informal. Whereas literary versus vernacular, this is a choice of 2 different languages. They're independent because refined language can be literary or vernacular. You can have literary language that's refined and vernacular language that is refined. And when it comes to vernacular language can be coarse or refined. Okay, little typo here that I need to change. Okay, so our options. Our options are to translate into the literary language. Number 2, to translate into the vernacular language. Number 3, to use a mix of literary and vernacular. And number 4, to use neither literary or vernacular. The 4th option does not exist, so Zan Ning goes on to say that there's no such thing. Okay. Let's look at the examples that Zan Ning gives for each of these. If we were to translate into only the literary language, you would basically be making the Buddhist sutras read like the Chinese classics. So all formal books are translated into this language in China. So you could say that this is a cultural tradition in Chinese society. If you want to present your text as a formal book, if you want it to be respectable, then you have to translate it into literary Chinese. But for certain passages or topics, you might want to use the vernacular. For example, when you're talking about beggars, this is one example that he uses, or slapping people on the face, then you might want to use the vernacular to make it seem more lively. And the third option, a mix of literary and vernacular, is when you have somebody who's translating who is not very good at writing literary Chinese. So he might mix in certain vernacular terms. This is before it's proofread, before somebody who knows better changes it. Okay, so that's option number 3, and there is no option number 4. Okay, so this is exploring the issue of diglossia in pre-modern China, whether to translate into literary or vernacular language. Now, all of this is getting a little technical, so maybe it's not as interesting, but for the last point, I think I may be able to get you a little more interested. Now, the last option is the distinction between literal and suggestive meaning. What does that mean? Well, to understand that, we need to look at the 3 types of meaning explored by Indian poetics in the 9th century. Okay, and in that period, they basically distinguished between 3 types of meaning, or 3 types of thoughts that surface in the mind when you see a word. What are the 3 types? There is the literal meaning, there is the figurative meaning, and there is the suggestive meaning. The literal meaning is what the word is supposed to mean on the surface of it. The figurative meaning is when you're using the word as a metaphor. It's pointing to one thing, but actually referring to something else. That's the figurative meaning. And the suggestive meaning is what a word calls to mind, okay, in addition to the literal and the figurative. Okay, you could think of this as a kind of connotation. Okay, this is hard to understand, so let me give you an example. A few examples, in fact. Let's look at this line from a newspaper back in 2002. McDonald's takes quarter pounding. Stock prices for the fast food chain drop with an expectation of its first ever quarterly loss. Let's think about the meaning of quarter pounding. Literal meaning. Pounding means to punch or hit something, right? That's the literal meaning of pound. But obviously, nobody is punching McDonald's. So we're not using the literal meaning of pound. What we're using here, or part of what we're using here, is the figurative meaning. When we say somebody or something takes a pounding, it means that they're taking a hard hit, and even that is a metaphor. What it means is something bad happens to them. Okay, and I think that meaning figures over here. So McDonald's is not doing very well in this quarter. That's why we say it's taking a quarter pounding. This is the figurative meaning of pounding. But if you think about the way they're using this word, why are they saying quarter pounding? It's because at McDonald's you can buy something called a quarter pounder. Okay. So by putting quarter and pounding together, it's suggestive of a quarter pounder, and that makes this line all the more clever. Okay, so with this, do people see the difference between literal meaning, figurative meaning, and suggestive meaning? Now, Zan Ning doesn't talk much about figurative meaning in his commentary. Okay, so we're basically just going to look at the contrast between literal meaning and suggestive meaning. And to make sure that everybody understands, let me give you a few more examples of suggestive meaning. Yeah. Oh, this is going to be, I would even say it's impossible to translate because you have the 3 different levels of meaning. This is one of the things where, if I get a chance to talk about Xuan Zang later, Xuan Zang talks about words with multiple levels of meaning. Very often when you get words with multiple levels of meaning, you either have to discard some of those levels, otherwise you would have to use something entirely different. And with quarter pounding, I don't think it's translatable. Anybody, what's a quarter pounder called in Chinese? Has anybody ever? Oh, that's true. That's true. All right, never mind then. Let's look at this example. Okay. So Zan Ning goes on to say that when you're translating, you have to consider 2 types of meaning. Okay, 世俗为直,设真为密. So there's a conventional reading, which is the literal meaning, the straightforward meaning. And there's another transcendental meaning, which we take to be the suggestive meaning or the hidden meaning. Let's look at this example. You've probably seen this on TV before.
Whether you golf or not, Geico could help you score some great savings on car insurance, maybe even hundreds of dollars. All in one, and that's the part 5, mind you.
Geico. Switch today and see all the ways you can save.
Okay, so that was an ad for Geico. Geico is an insurance company. I think it comes from Government Employees Insurance Company, but not many people know that. Most people just know it as Geico nowadays. And it uses as a mascot a gecko. Why do you think it used a gecko? Yeah, Geico sounds like gecko, right? Geico's not a real word in English. The closest word in English to Geico is gecko. So you could say that gecko is the suggestive meaning of Geico, and the advertising of Geico takes advantage of this. And you see a lot of this kind of stuff, for example.
Start newcarfacts.com.
Show me minivans with no reported accidents. Love it.
Show me the Carfax. Start your used car search at the allnewcarfax.com.
Okay, so that was an ad for Carfax, and their mascot is a car fox, because fox and fax sound similar. Now, I wanted to start with this because the example that Zan Ning gives is not as straightforward as this. I would say it's a little bit, at least it was a little bit hard for me to understand at first. Now, yeah? That's true. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So that makes it even more complicated. Facts, fact, and fax machine going on to facsimile. You could, separate all those different levels of meaning. Okay, now this is what Zan Ning does. He wants to contrast the meaning of para, that is the shore beyond or the other shore, and parusa, which is hurling abuse, or sometimes translated as harsh speech. Okay, so to give a little bit of background, the Buddhists talk about the 10 sins, right? Of the 10 sins, 3 are sins of the body, 3 are sins of the mind, and 4 are sins of speech. And the 4 sins of speech are sowing discord, spreading falsehoods, hurling abuse, and spewing nonsense. And he's talking about this one here, hurling abuse, parusa. Now, Zan Ning believes that parusa sounds like para, or thinking of parusa makes you think of para. Okay, para, we saw this in the Heart Sutra, Dharani, gate gate, para samgate bodhisvaha. So he's trying to create an association between these. So imagine this. Suppose you're translating a text with parusa, but everybody in this time, when you see the word parusa, you automatically think of para. What do you do in your translation? Do you translate only parusa and ignore the connotation of para? Or do you translate the connotation of para? Or is there any way to get both of these senses in your translation? That is the issue that Zan Ning was faced with. Okay, so his options. Option number 1, translate only the literal meaning. Option number 2, translate only the suggestive meaning. Option number 3, translate both the literal and suggestive meanings. And option number 4, translate neither the literal or suggestive meanings. Okay, and later on you'll see that his options are, to me at least, a little bit strange. I don't know if you would feel the same way, but let me give it to you. Option number 1 is to translate only the literal meaning. So that means that you would translate parusa as hurling abuse, with the understanding that if you hurl abuse at someone, they will distance themselves from you and place themselves beyond your reach. Okay, this is what he says in his explanation. This is option number 1. Option number 2 is to translate the suggestive meaning, translate it as para, the shore beyond, as preached by the Bodhisattva, in line with the doctrine of the 3 absences of nature, with the understanding that the other shore also is beyond the reach of the masses. Okay, to me, this doesn't seem like a viable option. Option number 3 is to translate both, which is to translate parusa as beyond reach, because number 1, if you hurl abuse at somebody, they will place themselves beyond your reach. Number 2, para also means beyond reach. So he believes that beyond reach is what is common to both of these words. So this would be option number 3. And option number 4 is to translate neither. Translate neither the literal meaning nor the suggestive meaning. And that is what happens when you do a phonological translation, for example, in which case the sound would contain no meaning. And he gives some of these examples which he says are translated into Chinese as phonological translations, but then in parentheses you have an explanation of what they mean. Okay, so when it comes to literal versus suggestive meaning, these are the options that Zan Ning gives people. Okay, so a quick recap then. I think we've covered all 6 of Zan Ning's innovations. And of these 6, you could see that 3 deal with intratextual considerations, and another 3 deal with extratextual considerations. The ones that are in blue are intratextual. The ones that are in red are extratextual. Innovation number 1, do you want to replace the sound or symbol? That is an intratextual consideration. Innovation number 2, are we translating from Sanskrit or from a Central Asian language? That is an extratextual consideration. Innovation number 3, is the translator a native speaker of Sanskrit or a native speaker of, or not a native speaker of Sanskrit? That is an extratextual consideration. Innovation number 4, do we use formal or informal language? That is an intratextual consideration. Innovation number 5, when we're translating into Chinese, do we use the literary Chinese of formal books, or do we use the vernacular Chinese of everyday speech? That is number 5. That is an extratextual consideration. And innovation number 6, do we translate the literal meaning or the suggestive meaning? That is an intratextual consideration. So he covers both of these aspects, and he gives them equal weight. This is Zan Ning's 6 innovations. Now, I have some applications of these ideas. Let's look at these applications. Let's see how we're doing for time. Let's say we spend about, I'll have until 10:30, right? How about I spend about 10 to 15 minutes on these applications, and then afterwards we'll try to cover some of Xuan Zang. That sound okay to people? Okay. Now, I want you to compare your current situation with what Zan Ning is talking about. How many of you are translating sutras into Chinese? Anybody? Into Chinese. Yeah, or some Central Asian language, maybe. Is there anybody that's translating sutras into English? Okay. Anybody that's translating sutras into other languages? What other languages do we have here? Norwegian, okay. Any others? Okay. So think about your situation and think about this. Imagine you're translating the Diamond Sutra into English. Would you want to translate it from the Sanskrit or would you want to translate it from the Chinese? How many of you would like to translate it from the Sanskrit? Okay. Anybody want to tell me why? Why you choose Sanskrit? Okay, because it's a direct translation. You don't have to go through another language. Okay, that would be a good reason. Any other reasons? Yeah. Okay, so you think that Indic culture back then is more similar to, let's say, American culture here than Chinese culture, so we don't need to take a detour. Okay, that's a good point too. Anything else? Now, those of you that are translating from the Chinese, what are your reasons? Ah, okay. So in terms of time, the Chinese version might actually be earlier. Okay, good. Any other reasons? Because you speak the language. Okay, so you don't speak Sanskrit or read Sanskrit. Okay, so that would be a legitimate reason too. Yeah. That is a very good reason, actually. There's a large body of commentaries that you can refer to when you're looking at the Chinese text. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Very good point. Now, let's try to imagine how Zan Ning would think about this. Okay, in innovation number 2, Zan Ning acknowledges the index source of the text. So we would probably think that the Diamond Sutra was composed in Sanskrit and then later translated into Chinese. If that is the case, as one of you mentioned earlier, translating from the Sanskrit would be a direct translation, whereas translating from the Chinese would be an indirect translation, so that would be preferred. But if we consider the issue from innovation number 3, if you're translating from Sanskrit, how good is your Sanskrit? How many native speakers of Sanskrit have you spoken to before? Have you lived in a Sanskrit-speaking society? Now, I have a lot of graduate students who are from China who studied English for many years and have pretty good English, but they still make mistakes when it comes to the finer nuances of English. And then there are people I know in the Chinese countryside who studied Chinese for a few years, but really cannot converse in English. Now, if that's their situation, how would you compare your Sanskrit to that situation? Would you be able to translate a sutra from Sanskrit, having never spoken to anybody before? That would be one consideration. And if you're translating from the Chinese, okay, I think somebody back there said, because you speak Chinese, so you're able to translate from the Chinese. You're probably thinking I'm a native speaker of Chinese, so I would be a good translator of Chinese. But here's the thing. This is written in literary Chinese, whereas you speak modern standard Chinese. And as we mentioned before, these are two very different languages, right? So just because you speak modern standard Chinese doesn't guarantee that your fluent in literary Chinese. In fact, I would argue that the relationship between modern standard Chinese and literary Chinese is kind of like the relationship between those Central Asian translators back then and the Sanskrit language. So your understanding of literary Chinese is partial, and you're going to be prone to replacing literary Chinese terms with a modern understanding of the term, which would often result in misunderstandings. Just like the examples we gave before of ya as elegant or in yi as phonological translation. When looking at it through a modern lens, you're going to be making these types of mistakes. So it's going to be a hard choice. Whether you're choosing to translate from the Sanskrit or from Chinese, you're going to have limitations. You're going to have weaknesses that prevent you from doing a very good job. And these are only the Sanskrit and Chinese choices. If you're translating into another language, let's say when you're translating into Norwegian, are you going to be doing a direct translation from the Chinese or Sanskrit, or are you going to be going through a third language? English, okay. And that would add another layer of complication, right? For a lot of you translating into other languages, Spanish, or I think I've encountered translators into Vietnamese, you're going to have this third layer, and that's going to make it even more complex. Okay, so that goes to show that these two factors that Zan Ning introduced are pretty important to think about. Okay, so what do we do about it? If our understanding of the source language is imperfect, are there any remedies? And I think the point that you mentioned earlier, I've met you before, but sorry, I forgot your name. Okay, Feda. Your point about the commentaries, I think that is a very good point. Using intertextuality to help us understand the text, that is a good way to do it. Okay, this kind of ties in with what I wanted to talk about here with extensive reading. The more you read of these texts, the better your understanding of them. So the situation could get better if you read more and rely on other texts. Another thing that would help is your understanding of the subject matter. Okay, let me give you an analogy. At my university, I teach linguistics, but I don't speak any French. If you were to give me a French textbook, let's say on linguistics, I don't read French, but I could probably tell you what it's about because I know what they're supposed to teach in a linguistics class. So even though you don't understand the language very well, if you understand Buddhism very well, if you have a good understanding of what they're trying to explain, that would also help you understand the text a little bit better. And using intertextuality, using subject matter proficiency, all of these are things that machines can do much better than we do. So I believe there will be a day where you could train artificial intelligences to go through these corpora, and through their understanding of relations between different texts, they may be able to give us further insight into what these texts mean. Okay, so these are some of the, this is my first example. The second example, let's take something like the Heart Sutra. Okay, again, same question. Do we translate from the Sanskrit or do we translate from the Chinese? And it's not as straightforward as the first example because we don't really know for sure whether the Heart Sutra was originally translated in composed in Sanskrit or Chinese, right? Some people say it's Chinese, some people say it's Sanskrit. So whichever way you choose, what is direct can be actually indirect. What seems indirect can actually be direct. So that complicates the picture even more. Okay, so these are some of the issues that we can think about when looking at Zan Ning's 6 innovations. All right then, now I'm going to go back and look at Xuan Zang's 5 untranslatables. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the intro section on Xuan Zang and jump straight into his 5 untranslatables. So Xuan Zang basically says that in translation, there are 5 situations where things are not, he calls it 五种不翻. When he says untranslatable, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't translate them. What he means is that you should adopt a phonological translation rather than try to translate the meaning. Now, I don't agree with Xuan Zang in all 5 situations, but I will tell you what the 5 situations are and how we deal with these 5 types of situations in modern times. But first, the 5 situations. The 5 situations are, number 1, 秘密故, which I translate as Mystique. Number 2, 含多义故, which I translate as Polysemy. Number 3, 此无故, which I translate as Realia. Number 4, 顺古故, which I translate as established convention. And the last one, 生善故, which I translate as added value. So let's look at what Mystique is, what Polysemy is, what Realia is, what established convention is, and what added value is. Okay, the first and the fifth are a little more complicated. The ones in the middle are a bit more straightforward. Okay, first, 秘密故. We actually already looked at this in Zan Ning. Now, if you look at the definition of the term 秘, it has the meaning of being deep. It has the meaning of being divine in some way. So the idea is that because by uttering this text, there is some sort of supernatural or divine power, therefore we need to preserve the sound. Okay, and the example that Xuan Zang gives is that of Dharani's. Okay, so an example of this would be the Dharani at the end of the Heart Sutra, the Gate Gate Para Gate Para Sam Gate Bodhisvaha. Okay, with text like this, because the mere utterance of these sounds produces a certain power, therefore we need to preserve the sound, therefore we need to translate it phonologically. Now, the question I want to ask people is, why does the utterance of these sounds produce a certain power? What kind of power exactly are you talking about? Now, Now, you could say that this is a mystical kind of power. For example, let me see, where did it go? There's the idea that it brings about protection or blessings. And if that's the case, then I can't really do anything about it because it's not a linguistic issue. It would become a religious issue. So there are people, let me see if I can find it. Oh. Okay, I have a quote somewhere, but yeah, it'll come up a little later. There are people who believe that this effect, this power, is because of a religious reason, and because of that, in linguistic commentaries or treatises, people don't really talk about that. Okay, that's one way to look at it. But the way I want to try to look at it is, what if it was something linguistic? Is there any linguistic effect or power that could be preserved when you translate the sound, but is not preserved when you translate the meaning? That is what I want to try to explore. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but let's look at some options. Okay, so what do you call something that happens when you utter a sound? If we could say something and make something change in this world, there is something like this in linguistics, and it's called a speech act, also known as an illocutionary act or a performative utterance. And this is something that is studied in the field of pragmatics. There is a certain type of language that when you say it, something in the world changes. Okay, what are some examples of this? To understand this better, we need to understand what is a speech act and what is not a speech act. What is not a speech act is something that is a description of the world. So if I were to say Sacramento is the capital of California, okay, that's not going to change anything in California. That's just a description of how things are. $1 is equal to 4 quarters. Okay, nothing changes. But if I were to say you're fired, okay, prior to this, you were an employee of mine. After my uttering this, you are no longer a member of this company. So by merely uttering this, the world changes. Or things like, I sentence you to 10 years in prison. Okay, after I say this, you go to prison for 10 years. Okay? So these are instances of language where when you utter something, the world changes. So that is my first theory. Could these Dharanis be a type of speech act? Could it be that when you say it, the world changes because of it? Or something like, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, this is where the quote is. Okay. So the Chinese scholar Zhu Ziqing says, when it comes to this untranslatable, it has only a religious significance, so he doesn't talk about it. But I believe it might be a speech act. And if it is a speech act, is Xuan Zang right in saying that with speech acts, we need to translate the term phonologically? Let's put it to the test. You're fired. If I translate it into Chinese phonologically, you're fired. Does that achieve the same effect? No. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Nothing happens, right? In fact, people wouldn't even understand what I'm talking about. So when it comes to speech acts, it looks like you cannot translate the term phonologically. You would have to translate it semantically in order for it to have the same effect. So although a speech act is something that changes something in the world, I don't think this is what they're referring to. If you translate it phonologically, it doesn't achieve the effect that we want. Okay, so if not a speech act, yeah. Mm-hmm. Ah, okay. But then the point of translation is to allow the language to be comprehensible. To a source language speaker. Right. But then if you're speaking to a source language speaker, why would you need to translate it? You don't need to, right? Oh, I see your point. Okay. So you're saying that if I use a phonological translation, then a Chinese speaker would be able to cause that effect in a source language environment. That's a good point. I never thought about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good point. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. But then we would have to understand that I guess the beings that we're speaking to, their language is the source language, Sanskrit in this case. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good point. Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah. Oh, sorry, are they what? That I don't know. I think somebody here probably understands the issue better than I do. Yeah. Sanskrit. Okay. Wow, that is a new understanding. I didn't get this last year. Thank you. Okay, so it looks like the speech act theory could actually work with the interpretation that you just provided. But since last year I didn't get this information, I had some other options, which is that another possibility is that something like a Dharani is a non-arbitrary sign. Okay, what does that mean? To explain it a little better, we need to understand what's an arbitrary sign and what's a non-arbitrary sign. In most human languages, we use sound to represent concepts. Most of these sounds have nothing to do with the concept that we represent. For example, this is called a microphone, right? Why does this thing have to be called a microphone? Is there something about it that's associated with the sound microphone? Nothing. So this is an arbitrary connection, an arbitrary sign. Whereas, what's a sign that's non-arbitrary? let's say something like bang to mean the sound of an explosion. Okay. The word bang itself sounds like an explosion. So by using bang to represent an explosion, there is a similarity between the sound that I use and the concept that I'm trying to represent. So do people see the difference between the two? Some words have an arbitrary relationship to their meaning. Some words have a non-arbitrary relationship to their meaning. Okay, now Ferdinand de Saussure, the father of modern linguistics, basically says that most concept sound relationships are arbitrary. So when you look at a tree and the word for tree, there is no relation. Now, the exception to this is onomatopoeic formations and interjections. Okay, and okay, I'm not going to go through all the different types. For example, a cat says meow. Okay, and in most languages of the world, the sound that a cat makes is something similar to meow. So in English, it's meow. In Swedish, I don't know. You speak Norwegian. Do you happen to? It's okay. It's also meow. And then, do we have any Spanish speakers? How do you say? What sound does a cat make in Spanish? But anyway. Oh, in Dutch. Okay. So you get the idea. Vietnamese? Okay. So when the connection is non-arbitrary, you might not necessarily have the same word in every language, but whatever word you have, it sounds a little bit like the actual phenomenon. And it's not just cat sounds, you also get lamb sounds, you get, the sound of sneezing. Okay. Achoo in English. What is it in Vietnamese? When you sneeze. Yeah. Achoo. Dutch? Achoo. Norwegian? Okay. So you get the idea. These are non-arbitrary relationships. Okay, let me skip a little. So could it be that a mantra is representing a non-arbitrary relationship between the sound and the phenomenon that it's trying to represent? Could it be that the words that we're uttering are actually in some way similar to a sound that it's supposed to represent? And if that's the case, then how do we translate them? Let's look at how we translate non-arbitrary sounds, non-arbitrary words from English to Chinese. Okay, in English, when you hear the camera click, the photo is taken and displayed for review for 3 seconds. I think if you were to translate it into Chinese, you would say, 当你听到相机咔嚓一声，表示照片已经拍摄. So the click becomes 咔嚓. Now what's happening here is click and ka-cha both imitate the sound of the shutter, but they imitate it differently. And in this case, I don't think you can translate click directly as kalika, because then a Chinese speaker would not understand what it is, because the Chinese term for it is ka-cha. So in a way, this kind of disproves what Xuan Zang is trying to say, right? This is in situations where the target language already has a word for what you're trying to express here. I'll give you another example. Okay, so Chinese 时间滴滴答答的流逝. Okay, 滴滴答答 is the sound of time ticking away. But if you were to translate it as 滴滴答答, an English speaker would not know what that means, because in English, the word is tick or tick-tock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Time is ticking away. So it looks like if it's a non-arbitrary sign, we have to do it this way. We have to ask, how does the target language express that idea in its language? Now, I also gave this example last year. What sound does a frog make? Anybody? Oh, in your language. Quack? Okay. Any other languages? Nepali, What sound does a frog make? So, when my son was really young, we had him listen to, or rather, we had him watch on YouTube a lot of these Chinese programs for kids to help him learn some Chinese. And there was this song that he listened to over and over again about this little frog. So those of you that know Chinese, the song goes like this. Oh. 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 Okay, so you get the idea, but I need to skip this first. How do I go to the next? Okay. Now, in that song, the frog makes a bop, bop, bop sound. And then my son went to daycare, and at daycare, the teacher asked him, what sound does a frog make? And he said, bop, bop, bop. And the teacher says, no, a frog goes ribbit, ribbit. Okay, so that goes to show that onomatopoeia manifests itself differently in different languages. And if you were to translate an onomatopoeic word, you would have to know in the target language what that word is. So if we believe that Irani are non-arbitrary expressions, then the way to do it, the way to translate it, isn't to translate it phonologically, but to ask how it's expressed in the target language. Okay, no time for this, so let's skip this. And one last thing I want to say about preserving, yeah. Okay, let me see. Do I cover this here or? The same approach doesn't work for all non-arbitrary signs. And I'll be talking about, I'll have some examples a little bit further on, but really briefly, things like interjections, you can make the same argument. Something like ouch, or I guess achu would be an example of that too. For those, the words for those would be language specific also. And then later on, I'll have some further examples of phonesthesia, where you have sound associations that have a certain meaning in one language, which you probably would not find in another language. But I'll leave that for a little later. Okay. But one other dimension I want to introduce here is that even if you were to translate something phonologically, the sounds may change over time, and that may change things. So going on to our earlier theory about, let's say, if our audience is, say, the spirits who pronounce the words in that way, and by giving a phonological translation, we're making it so that our audience would understand. A problem with that is over time, sound changes may happen and make the sounds very different. So let's look at the Heart Sutra mantra that we have here. Okay, if we take the Sanskrit to be gate gate, para gate, para sam gate, bodhi svaha, the Middle Chinese comes pretty close at gate gate, bala gate, para sang gate, bodhi sabaha, okay, with some changes made to fit the syllable structure of Middle Chinese. But from Middle Chinese to Modern Standard Chinese, a number of sound changes have happened. So the gya sequence has palatalized to become jie. So instead of gate, you have jiedi, which you might argue is very different from what the Sanskrit is. Okay. And as it goes on into other languages, for example, Korean, in Korean, the gate becomes ache. You could also argue that that is very different. And the Japanese, okay. In Japanese, wherever you get these D sounds, whenever you get a D followed by an E vowel, that palatalizes to a G sound. And then in Japanese, the labials followed by an A have weakened to a ha. So in Japanese, instead of bara gyate, you have hara gyate. And then instead of bode or bodi, you have boji. So sound change can alter a lot of this. And after these sound changes, you could also argue that it no longer sounds like what it was supposed to sound like. That adds another level of complication. Okay, so to recap on untranslatable number 1. First, if we assume the Dharani to be a non-arbitrary sign, then we do want to preserve the sound, but we also need to recognize cross-linguistic variation, and there are also challenges to preserving sound, such as the interlingual dimension of nativization and the temporal dimension of sound change. And there are some other non-arbitrary signs that it would seem you can't really preserve the sense in any way. Or rather, no, before I go there, let me mention something else. There also seem to be some aspect of this sound meaning connection that appear to be universal, no matter what language you are speaking. Okay, we get some of this from psycholinguistics. For example, let's say we have 2 tables here. One is bigger, one is smaller. In a particular language, one of these is called mill, the other is called mall. Which one do you think is the bigger one? Is the bigger one mall or is it mill? Most people would say that mall is the bigger one, mill is the smaller one, even though you don't speak this language. And what's happening here is that there seems to be a universal connection between the extent to which you open your jaw. So is the vowel where you open your jaw the widest, and e is the vowel where you open your mouth opening is the smallest. So the wider you open your mouth, the larger the concept. Yeah. Oh, I would have to double check. I don't have that data over here. Yeah. But there are some, I could point you to the original studies. I could probably email it to you. Yeah. And another effect, the Maluma Takiti study. This was also mentioned recently in the news. So 2 words in a language, Maluma and Takiti, corresponding to 2 shapes. Which one is Maluma? Is it the round one or is it the angular one? Again, most people would say the round one. And the argument for that is that when pronouncing the M is a labial sound. So you tend to associate that with, the lips is where you make lip rounding. So you tend to associate that with rounder concepts. And sounds such as t and k are plosives. There are sounds where you use particular part of the tongue to restrict the airflow. So you tend to associate that with sharper concepts. So things like this tend to be universal. And if there's something in the Dharanis that makes use of this, then that could also be something that is universal. And Buba Kiki, same thing. Okay. I was going to talk about phonesthesia, but we don't have a lot of time left, so is it okay if I skip that and go on to the other 5 translatables? Okay. The second untranslatable is what you do when a word has more than one meaning. What do you do when a word has a lot of different meanings? And the example that Xuan Zang gives is the word bagavat, which he says has 6 different meanings, and you can't possibly find a Chinese word with all 6 of these meanings. So what do? You translate the sound and forget about trying to replace it with a word. Now, is that practical? Let's look at some modern examples. At my university, we have this room here called the Chinese Reading Room. And the way we explain it is we have a dedicated reading room for Chinese students. But when you think about it, what does it mean, the word Chinese students? It could mean students who are majoring in Chinese or studying Chinese. It could also mean students who come from China who are ethnically Chinese. And we obviously mean the first and not the second, right? But how do I make this clear in a translation? Yes, you would have to further explain it. Just translating it phonologically isn't going to solve the problem, right? If I were to translate it into Chinese, 这个读书是给 Chinese 学生专用的. That's not going to help, right? Okay, so I believe we have a solution that is different from what Xuan Zang suggested. A few more examples that lean in this direction. I left my bat in the cage. It could be that I have this kind of bat, it's in the cage. Or it could be my baseball bat that I left in the batting cage. Okay, what do we do when we're trying to translate something like this? It's unlikely that I'll have a sentence that uses both of these meanings, right? In most situations, I would refer to either this or that, not both. So, like Heng Yishi said, I would rely on the context to tell me which one it is, and after I determine which one it is, I make it unambiguous in the target language. Okay, similarly, I don't like this dish. It could mean the actual dish or the food. There's a bug in the device. It could be there's a problem or there's a spying device. And to translate this, you first determine the context. Okay, but there are some situations where you have dual actualization, and that makes it a lot harder to translate. Let me give you this English example. The man who would call a spade should be compelled to use one. It is the only thing he is fit for. Okay. Now, to call a spade means to be very direct. So this author doesn't like people who speak too directly. But on the other hand, you also need the literal meaning of a spade, because he is saying that if he speaks that way, then he should go use a spade and dig, and that's the only kind of work he should do. And when it utilizes both levels of meaning like this basically makes this sentence impossible to translate, unless you have something that is equivalent in the target language, let's say in Chinese. In my classes, my students did come up with a solution for that, but I don't think it's too important here, so I'm going to skip it. Okay, another example that we used is the I Ching, the E in the I Ching. It has 3 levels of meaning: simplification, change, and invariance, right? And it's not going to be possible to find a word in English that has all 3 of these meanings, which is why, in this case, it makes sense to translate the term phonologically. Okay, so this is polysemy. Yes. Oh, I see. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. True. True. Okay. Do you encounter a lot of these in Buddhist translation as well? Buddhist terms. Or I don't. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let me move on to the next point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you talking about this point or the next one, where they deal with cultural phenomenon? Oh, okay. All right, so the next one, Realia. Okay, so this is where we're talking about things that exist in one culture but don't exist in another. So in Xuan Zang's case, things that exist in India but don't exist in China. And he gives the example of the jambu tree. So he says that you have this tree here that's common in India, but you don't see it in China. What do? You translate the sound. So you call it a jambu shu. Okay. And you'll notice that what he does is, it's not a complete phonological translation. He uses the phonological component of jambu, but then he adds the semantic element of tree to it. Okay, that's one way we could do this. And in modern translations, we use a number of different strategies for translating realia, such as these. So, for example, we could use this very same strategy in, when Jeep is translated into Chinese, it's called a jipu che. So we add the vehicle element, but we use the jipu sound. Or ice cream. Ice cream is 冰淇淋. We use the semantic component 冰 to translate ice, and then 麒麟 is a phonological translation of cream. Okay, so we could use a phonosemantic hybrid of this sort. We could use a pure phonological translation, such as cafe to coffee, sandwich to 三明治. We could use a semantic translation, pure semantics, hot dog to 热狗, football to 足球. And then in some cases, you could have a phonosemantic match, where it's at the same time a phonological translation, but also a semantic translation. So for example, laser becoming 镭射, which sounds similar, but also means lightning shooting, or something like hacker becoming 黑客 or 骇客, which also has a similar semantic meaning. Okay, so what we're trying to say here is that when it comes to realia, in modern times, we don't just use one strategy, but a number of different strategies. Okay, number 4 is, I'm going to skip number 4. Number 4, what he's basically saying is something might not be the best translation, but since we've had it for so long, we're just going to go along with it. Okay, I'm sure you're able to think of examples of this sort. So I'm going to skip to number 5, which is added value, which is something that is often misunderstood, I believe. 生善故 is the original Chinese. A lot of people see 善 and think it has something to do with goodness, but I don't think it's goodness in the moral or ethical sense. I think it's goodness in the sense of preference or sophistication. Now, the example Xuan Zang gives is that of prajna. Okay, prajna means wisdom. So you could just translate it as wisdom in Chinese, something like 智慧, but Xuan Zang thinks it's too vulgar. It's used too often. It doesn't have that level of prestige and respect. So he would rather use a phonological translation which introduces a certain sophistication to the text. Okay, and we want to ask, is that what we do today? Okay, modern examples. Anybody drink this? This is a latte. Now, why do we call it a latte? Latte just means milk, right? Why don't we just call it milk coffee? Milk coffee doesn't sound as sophisticated as latte, right? So to get that sense of sophistication, we would rather call it latte rather than milk coffee. And the same works for Chinese. Okay, so if you look at, sorry to bring these McDonald's menus again, but the point I want to make is there is a word for cheese in Chinese. It's called 乳酪 or 甘酪. But you almost never see it in things like cheeseburgers. Why? Because the phonological translation 芝士 or 起司 makes it sound more sophisticated. So people would rather use the foreign term for the mere purpose of sophistication. And you get that with the contrast between lingerie and underwear, or haute couture and high fashion. Okay, so in a lot of situations, the foreign term sounds better, and therefore we prefer to use it. Okay, so that is like rushing through the 5 untranslatables really quickly, but I think my time is up, so I will just stop here and see if people have questions. Thank you. Yeah, so that's a very good point. It helps when you have a similar concept like Dao that you could use, but I would like to point out that it's also a double-edged sword, because when you use a pre-existing concept, there's some baggage that comes with the concept that you might not want to use. So there's always the choice between, should we, what's the word I'm looking for? Should we repurpose an existing word, or should we make up a completely new word? And it's not a complete black or white choice, because there's always options in between, like what was mentioned before about the flower. You could always use half and half. You could always use components of each. And that, I think, is what the translator has to weigh. What produces the maximum effect? What gives the reader the maximum understanding with the least amount of unwanted meanings? And that, I think, is the translation strategy that works the best. But when you're looking at just one concept, of course you could do that. But when this one concept is part of a larger text, you also have to look at how everything fits together. Sometimes if you adopt one strategy, you kind of have to adopt similar strategies for other things in order to make everything consistent. So that, I think, all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And if I can add one more thing about the Dao, there was actually a lot of discussion about this in the context of Xuan Zang, which I didn't get to talk about. Let me see. I can't remember if it was in the same text, but Xuan Zang does talk about whether it's a good idea to borrow Taoist ideas when translating Buddhist texts. And Xuan Zang says yes. He says if it helps people understand it better, then of course use Taoist ideas to translate Buddhist texts. But he doesn't believe in it the other way around. He is then asked, is it a good idea to borrow Taoist concepts when you're, no. Is it a good idea to borrow Buddhist contexts when you're trying to translate Chinese Taoist text into Sanskrit? Do you think that would help the Indians understand it better? And he says, of course not. He actually thought it was preposterous. And the way he looked at it, I guess we might be able to understand it through an analogy. Let's say you want little kids to understand Shakespeare. Okay, so is it a good idea to turn Shakespeare into a cartoon? Do you think that would help them understand it better? Okay. Now let's say you want Shakespeare scholars to appreciate cartoons more. So if we were to replace Shakespeare characters with cartoon characters like Super Mario, do you think that would help them like cartoons better? Probably not, right? And Xuan Zang kind of thinks of the relationship between the two kind of like that. So yeah, there you go. Okay, well, thank you.